I'm really curious where people are joining from.
Yeah.
Can you see, Mark, where people registered from?
No, we were going to invite people to put it in the chat.
Oh, nice. Well, I'll let you do that. And we're live on YouTube. Great.
Oh, there you go. We already have some people saying hello.
Hi, Sonia from Ames, Iowa. Great. Anna, do you know if anyone from the Soil Network is joining?
I don't know. I hope so. I don't know. Yeah. There are so many that like we spoke about it on the phone the other day. There's 450 members now, I think. So I'm not even trying to keep tabs on everyone. Yeah, I hope so. I hope some farmers join. I always like that.
Yeah.
They always ask very good questions.
Are there any farmers here? Any attendees? Or part-time farmers? Or academic retiring into farming?
Not sure.
Okay, I think we'll get started.
Okay.
All right, well, welcome everyone, and good afternoon or good morning or maybe evening, depending on where you're tuning in from. But thank you all so much for joining us. And we're really excited to welcome you to the second seminar in our 75 years of rural sociology at Wageningen series. And I also want to welcome people that are tuning in to our live stream on YouTube as well as those here with us in Zoom. So my name's Mark Vickol, and along with my colleague in the Rural Sociology group at Wageningen University, Lizette Nicole, who had to leave us, unfortunately, we are convening this seminar series, which is running until May next year. And before we get to today's speaker, I just wanted to say a little bit about the inspiration and theme of the seminar series for those that weren't with us in the first seminar. So rural sociology as a distinct discipline has a really long and proud history at Wageningen University. And this year and next year, we're celebrating 75 years of the rural sociology research group here. And so we thought that at this 75-year anniversary, it's timely for us to not only reflect on the past contributions of our research group, but to also look to the future. And so the theme of this seminar series is looking back, looking forward, setting a future agenda for rural sociology. And we thought there was no better way to help us set this agenda than to invite those scholars from all over the world who inspire us and our work. And so we are really thrilled with the group of scholars who have agreed to contribute to the seminar series. And over the next 12 months or so, we'll navigate a number of themes core to rural sociology. So please keep an eye on our blog and social media accounts for details of each seminar. So just some brief housekeeping before I hand over to my RSO colleague, Dr. Una Morrow, who will introduce today's speaker. This session is being live streamed on YouTube and recorded. The presentation will last for 45-50 minutes and followed by a brief response from Una, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. For the Zoom attendees, you can type a question at any time using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Alternatively, during the Q&A session, you can use the raise your hand button and we can unmute you to ask your question directly. Those tuning in via YouTube are welcome to leave questions you might have in the comments section of the YouTube feed there, and we'll be monitoring that as well. And then finally, since we are using this Zoom webinar format, we can't see our lovely audience and our audience cannot see each other, only the panelists. So we welcome everyone to introduce themselves briefly in the chat so we get a sense of who's present and where you're tuning in from. And I already see we have a significant presence of those from Ames, Iowa, which is very exciting. So interested to hear where everyone else is tuning in from as well. But with that, I'll pass over to Una.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I'm Una Morrow. I'm an assistant professor in the Rural Sociology group. And also, like Mark, I still feel a bit like a newbie to this long legacy of rural sociologists. And it's my immense honor to introduce Dr. Anna Krzywoszynska. She is a Faculty of Social Sciences Research Fellow at the University of Sheffield, where she's located in the Department of Geography. And she also serves as Associate Director of the University of Sheffield Institute for Sustainable Food. In addition to that, she is the founder of the Soil Care Network, which is an international and interdisciplinary community of scholars and practitioners animated by the love of and fascination with and dedication to soils. The network provides a place for people who love soil to connect and find each other, exchange knowledge, and support one another, including through the recently launched Soil Talks series, which I encourage everyone to check out. It looks awesome. Anna's research concerns agriculture and food as key spheres for the interaction between human and more than human worlds. She is especially interested in environmental knowledge, ethics, and affect, and how these shape and are shaped by rural and food-related spaces and practices. Her work engages frequently with the natural sciences. Consequently, her research also investigates the potential for opening up the spaces of scientific knowledge production to non-certified expertise. And we talked about this a little bit earlier in the week as really a desire to take back science, in a sense, and take back knowledge production. So in addition to this, she's interested in challenging the persistent division of labor between the social and natural sciences and speaking about materiality, life, and ecology. For the last few years, Anna has been exploring the reconceptualization of soils as lively ecosystems in conventional agricultural practice and its related knowledge fields and the consequences of this for the future of agriculture and land use. She has published widely in the fields of agri-food studies and rural sociology on a range of topics, including soil, care, microbes, relationality, attentiveness, farmers' knowledge, alternative food networks, affect and artificial intelligence, community energy, and waste. And it's indeed through her writings on soil and attentiveness and care that I became attracted to her work and thought she would be an awesome speaker for this series. So I'm thrilled that she's accepted our invitation. So in addition to these writings, she's also the co-editor of the book, Thinking with Soils, Material Politics and Social Theory. And this afternoon, she joins us at the Rural Sociology 75-year anniversary seminar series to deliver the talk toward a Gaian agriculture. Please join me in welcoming Anna. I'll hand it off to you, Anna.
Thank you so much. That was such a lovely introduction. Thank you, Una. Thank you, Mark. And thank you, everyone at Rural Sociology for having me. I'm delighted. I'm really excited to be giving this talk and participating in this really important event. And thank you from the bottom of my heart for the amazing hamper that turned up half an hour ago, which means that now I'm on a serious sugar rush, which is fantastic. So I'm just going to share my screen so that I can share the presentation with you. And I'm going to go straight into it because there is a lot I would like to tell you, and I can't wait to hear your reactions and to have a broader conversation about the themes in the Q&A. Right. So I'm going to talk to you, as Una mentioned, about my work on soil, but I want to situate it a little bit more broadly, quite a bit more broadly, within what I see as a really urgently needed transformation in what it means to do research on and what it means to produce knowledge about human environmental relations, and why I think that rural sociology has an amazing role to play in this transformation. So let's open up with this term, the Anthropocene. Let's tackle that first. So for me, I think a lot with the term Anthropocene, and for me, it really is a way to indicate that the era in which we find ourselves today is a period of unprecedented power, but at the same time of unprecedented vulnerability of the human, and scare quotes around the homogenizing of this category. But as Earth's planetary systems become increasingly disrupted by certain activities of certain humans, so the dependence of humanity as a whole on these systems actually is becoming more and more broadly accepted. And I find that very interesting, that frameworks such as nature-based solutions, socio-ecological systems, even environmental services or circular economies, they are all entering everyday thinking in social sciences and in natural sciences, as well as more broadly. And I think this indicates to me that this acceptance of the dependence of humans on the natural system is becoming a more commonplace thought than previously. But that's not enough. An additional step is really urgently needed. Because while the dependence may be increasingly acknowledged, the nature and society as two spheres of knowledge and of action keep being maintained separately in these conversations. And for me, if there is one lesson that the Anthropocene is teaching us and will continue teaching us, is that, as Leslie Green puts it, to keep society and environment as two separate concepts is an empirical failure. And so to come to terms and to actually deal with humans as planetary actors, we can't go on depending on forms of knowledge making which maintain the separation of these two spheres. We can't go building something on a division. We can't continue building our understanding of the world and of ourselves in the world as if Earth was a passive background to human progress. So this the kind of the phrase we need to take seriously, well, we really do need to take seriously the codependence of humans and other entities to survive, really, frankly. And in many ways, I feel like the social sciences are a step ahead in this process, through the many turns that we have gone through and continue going through: the material turn, the non-human turn, the affective turn. And rural sociology is very much turning with these turns. We have started to turn around our conceptions within social sciences of what it means to be human and what it means to build societies, who is a member of societies. So I think rural sociology not only has played a role there, but is really well placed to continue driving this trajectory. However, it takes two to tango. So there is the other part of the conversation that is needed, and that is the collaboration with natural sciences. And Ulrich Beck argued that it's through the Anthropocene, actually, that natural sciences are finally starting to catch up with the insight that societies and economies are profoundly shaped by non-human agencies, that we can't understand them in separation from non-human agencies. So I think the Anthropocene is a concept that can bring us together in a very productive way across these disciplinary divides. So I started by talking about the Anthropocene, but for the rest of the presentation, I will be more speaking about Gaia. And here I'm going to tell you why I prefer to talk about Gaia than to talk about the Anthropocene. Lovelock and Margulis first popularized the term Gaia to refer to the capacity of life on Earth to self-regulate so that conditions for life are maintained. The existence of life on the planet is supported. And I really like what Isabel Stengers has done with the concept of Gaia, which she moved from the purely natural scientific sphere into a more hybrid space, which is very fruitful. And Stengers gives the name Gaia to a variety of processes and entities, which she says have their own regime of activity and sensitivity, or their own telos, which unfolds in a response to, but also with an indifference to human activities. And it's these processes and these entities which are now intruding, she says, into this imperialistic modernity that we have kind of built the modern civilization on, the idea of the separation between humans and natures. And this intrusion is mostly felt, I think, or maybe most popularly thought of as climate change, but obviously it is much more than that. It's a variety of other processes. In Gaia, for Stengers, and I would really agree with her, we are dealing with a nature that's capable of threatening our modes of thinking and living for good. It's a more than human that asserts itself and refuses to leave. So we move beyond this point of non-humans are important to non-humans are existential. They are an existential importance and an existential threat. And I've illustrated Gaia here with a figure of Kali, which I think has a certain resonance in that it reminded me of this quote from Stengers, where she says that Gaia is well named because she was honored in the past as the fearsome one. She was addressed by peasants who knew that humans depend on something much greater than them, something that tolerates them, but with a tolerance that is not to be abused. So for me, this question of what it means not to abuse the tolerance of Gaia is a driving question. And that's the one I would like you to keep in mind as we go through the presentation. How do we survive the environmental breakdown brought about by certain of our activities by learning how to participate in Gaia and keeping what Stengers calls her ticklish reactivity at bay? What forms of knowledge do we need in order to tread carefully with Gaia? And how does this connect to agriculture? Well, agriculture is this really key sphere in which we need to build new forms of knowing that would allow us to keep Gaia at bay. Because at the heart of it, agriculture is a relationship between humans and ecosystems. And paying attention to and acting appropriately on feedback loops between farming and agri-environments is a very basic principle of sustainable agriculture. But this and the simple principle for me really chimes with Stengers' thinking of Gaia, because for Stengers, Gaia's intrusion makes it clear that true sustainability means attending to how to compose with non-human entities. So it means a sort of a nestling. I like to think of it as a nestling of human activity within planetary boundaries, so that our activities are harmonious with the already existing activities that support life on the planet. But modern agriculture, I don't need to tell you, has become an enemy of Gaia, and it's an enemy of our own survival. And for me, the interest here especially has been around the recent rise of concern of modern agriculture in terms of its impacts on soil and the destruction of soils. Soils are foundational to agriculture and to all terrestrial life. They are the foundation of all existence on the dry surface of the planet. Without the thin layer of organically rich minerals, life on the planet, on its dry surface, is basically impossible. It's very fascinating, and if you look into Earth history, how life has always co-evolved with the soil. The careful managing of soil has always been very important to human civilizations, but in modernity and in modern agriculture, this attention and this care is not there anymore. And as a result, we are seeing this growing alarm around the consequences of this loss of attention to soils and calls for change. I'm a member of the Assembly for the mission of Horizon Europe Mission for Soil Health and Food. And the mission statement, which I really love, especially that it was created by natural scientists, is caring for soil is caring for life. I think it summarizes it very well. So I will be talking through, I'll be dealing with my research in soil in order to ask these questions about what it means to create attention to soils as a crucial instantiation of Gaia, and what stands in the way. How can we think through our relationship with soil to draw this broader lessons about how we need to behave more widely in relation to Gaia. And my thinking here is very much influenced by Arendt, who's not usually brought into political ecology, but I have found her extremely, extremely fruitful in thinking about the Anthropocene and thinking about Gaia. So I'll be drawing here on Arendt's The Human Condition, where she proposes basically 3 interlinked conditions under which life is given to humanity. This is her proposal. That there are these 3 conditions: labor, which is needed, which we could think of as the most kind of animal basis of human existence. It's that which is needed to maintain life of an organism and of the species. That's labor. Then work, which is the production of artifacts which give human experience durability. So it's more than the animal reproduction of life. It's that which starts to create a society. It's something that carries beyond a singular human life, a human existence. And the third condition under which human life kind of operates, in Arendt's terms, is activity. And that's the public and collective creation of meanings and values, or the politics, the life politic, in the broad sense of politics, as ethics, as the reason for existence, as the nature of society. And so together, these conditions enable human beings to maintain their existence as a species and as organisms. And at the same time, they give rise to something that is very unique to humanity, and that's natality, the capacity to begin anew for the sake of durability and futurity of the world that we hold in common. So that's the novelty that every human being brings into the world, and that they can use to change that world. So to be fully human, according to Arendt, is to be free to always generate new beginnings in this space between being earthbound as material beings, as animals, and being world creating as working beings, as creative beings. But this human condition is challenged or changed in modernity, and that's due to 2 key factors: the dominance of the scientific ontology of nature and the contraction of the political sphere. This is what Arendt calls earth alienation and world alienation. Starting with earth alienation, what are we talking about here? So for Arendt, earth alienation is something that was initiated with the separation of humans and earth, if you like, emerging with Galileo's telescope and the idea that the world is something to be observed externally. This shifts attention from previous forms of making knowledge about the earth, which were embedded in action, towards the observation and creation of facts, as if the consequences of these facts didn't matter, in a nutshell. Embodied perception in this new scientific ontology is no longer a possible starting point for the investigation of nature, because the testimony of the senses no longer bears relation to the underpinning laws of the universe, which can only be discovered through scientific instrumentation. And as a result, common sense experience, and so the multiple ways in which we as individuals encounter reality, it can no longer be an anchoring point for politics. And that's really important, something to keep in mind for later in the talk. So what happens then is that from a source of meaning, Earth becomes an object for manipulation and for experimentation. And that's a really crucial shift, because Arendt sees human life as necessarily rooted in this moral cyclicality of nature, but it's separated from this cyclicality by the pursuit of immortal meaning. And what enables this pursuit of immortal meaning, which always takes more than one human life, is the creation of a durable world of artifacts, the things that we produce through work, like academic texts or presentations or computers or recipes or bowls. So in this way, thought and activity are sort of prevented from just dissolving into nature and becoming part of nature, but we take something and we carry it on. But in the modern age, technosciences are the ultimate manifestation of work, because they are literally creating the artificial conditions of our existence as we exist today. The problem with technoscience, however, is the products that they bring into the world no longer guarantee durability, because technosciences act directly into nature. And through that, they inject unpredictability, which is characteristic of human action, straight into the material world. And in this way, they threaten the permanence of this earth. For Arendt, who was writing in the 50s, obviously the atomic bomb was the greatest sort of manifestation of that power of technoscience to change the very conditions of human existence as a species. So that's Earth alienation. And it comes together with world alienation, which is linked with the rise of capitalism and a concern with labor. So remember, labor is that which makes, which is foundational to human life as an animal species, to reproduction, basically. But with the rise of capitalism, what happens with labor is that it is elevated from the private sphere, where it used to be situated before, into the public sphere. In fact, for Arendt, modernity is characterized by labor becoming the organizing principle of collective life. And this has really profound consequences, because the dominance of labor debases, for Arendt, political life from a search for immortal values to a very simple management of the material conditions of collective existence. So what should be an arena where different individuals come together and engage freely on equal terms becomes instead a space of pure administration. And if you ever study governments today, that may ring very true. It certainly rings very true to me. From a search for values and the meaning for societies, we are increasingly concerned as governments with the pure administration of material flows that enable the existence of societies as groups of bodies, as groups of individuals. So the object of control becomes the efficient organization of resources and of populations. And this control is increasingly grasped by a technocratic bureaucracy, which assumes the interest of the society as a whole in economics. Economics becomes elevated to the principal political concern. So Earth alienation and world alienation come together, and they actually reinforce one another. As societies dedicate themselves to an ever deeper control over the earthly conditions of human existence and an ever more efficient labor process, at the same time, individuals lose their capacity for creating meaning from either a shared experience of nature or from participation in public life and a shared search for immortal values, for meaning, societal meaning. And that's not just a structural issue, but also an issue of individuals' self-perceived role within modern society. Are we first thinkers? Are we first creators? Or are we first workers? Attempts at articulating or even conceiving of an alternative in such a system become really hard. And I will give you some examples of how hard they do become in practice. All is rolled into the endless pursuit of usefulness and utility, which are established as the ultimate standards for life and the world of men. Right, quite dark. So how does all of this matter to agriculture? Well, very much, very much. I found reading about earth alienation and world alienation extremely pertinent to my own understanding of the change which occurred in the modern period in human relations with soils and with agri-environments more broadly. I'll be brief on this because I think you'll be familiar with this quite a bit. But briefly, beginning in the kind of late 17th century, and definitely most pronouncedly in the 20th century, the side of knowledge production about agriculture shifted from what I've represented here by Bruegel's sort of dwelt-in agrarian landscape to the experimental farm and laboratory of research institutes. That's where knowledge started to be made. And that has consequent changes to both the nature of agri-environmental knowledge and to the nature of communities that make this knowledge. So initially as private enterprises and later as part of state governance, these institutions became the primary and privileged sources of knowledge about farming environment interactions. And their work increasingly enacted a split between research on productive and on unproductive nature, or agronomy and ecology. And within agronomy, there was then a further split between research and advisory functions. And this all persists to this day. So in modern farming, farmers and growers encounter scientific ontologies and epistemologies of thinking through nature, these scientific tools for thinking about their relationship with nature practically all the time, either through agronomic training or through the agronomic advisors that they employ. So agronomy has become a very domesticated science in farming, and that means that farmers also resist it in a certain way. But at the same time, it is very normalized. It's a very normalized way of thinking about human environmental interactions in terms of science rather than in terms of own experience. So this scientific ontology and scientific epistemology, especially nearly epistemology, that science is the way to study nature, is really upheld and it's very normalized in agrarian communities. And this also produces a preference for quantification as the basis for decision making. When you're thinking about improving your farm or improving its performance, you want to see some numbers. I love that quote that occurs all the time in interviews with farmers, especially advisors. You can't manage what you can't measure, which goes in the face of 2,000 years of agricultural experience or 10,000 years of agricultural experience in which we have certainly managed without measuring. So all of these debates about legitimate and useful ways of knowing nature are currently reignited in a very interesting way in the concerns around soil destruction, which I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. And here, a very important dimension and a very disruptive dimension is the emerging attention to soil life. Soils are full of living organisms, and we have known this for a long time, but a scientific study of soil life is actually very recent. Today, soil microbial life is understood, is acknowledged in soil sciences and environmental sciences, in earth sciences, to be absolutely key to soil functions and to the functions of environments. And the term soil health, which has kind of come to signify this biological dimension of soil, keeps cropping up in policies, in private enterprises. It is even now starting to be put into law or as a basis of new forms of financing for agriculture. And what's really interesting is that this concern with soil health and with the living ecosystems which underpin soil health, it transcends these established dichotomies between conventional and alternative farming and modern and traditional, in ways that I'll come to explain in a second. So for me, this rising interest in living soil is a really fascinating and crucial site of struggle over the future of human relations with Gaia, really. Because I think that if we take this concept of soil as living seriously, it has a real power, a potential to reconfigure how we practice agriculture and how we practice being human in the future. Not to make too grand a claim, but I think it's super important. So I'm going to bring into this presentation voices from my research participants across a number of different research projects. I have mainly been discussing these issues with UK farmers and growers who we could describe as regenerative farmers or people practicing regenerative agriculture. It's a very broad umbrella term for the new forms of farming, which are trying to basically farm with living soil ecosystems. And I can go into more detail about what this regenerative agriculture is and how it's different to organic or previous forms of farming. It is a minority, definitely. Regenerative agriculture is still a minority, but it is really increasingly influential. And there even recently was a documentary on Netflix, Kiss the Ground, which basically talks about regenerative agriculture. So just to give you an idea. So I have been speaking to these farmers about their practices of knowing soils and creating knowledge about soils, especially in light of this increased focus on living soil, on soil organisms. And what I have found with these farmers is that a normal form of relating to soils in agriculture is what can be termed farming by numbers. And this farming by numbers is a nexus of agronomy and of financial accounting. It's the pinnacle of quantification. And it's a very powerful moral ontology as well in human environmental relations and farming. It's the benchmark against which all forms of soil knowledge and soil relationality are then measured by my participants. Quantification, as I mentioned, is this preferred basis for decision making in farming, and farming by numbers is what allows it and what epitomizes it in a way. So in farming by numbers, soil fertility is understood primarily as influenced by mineral nutrient levels. This is sort of a classic agronomy perspective that primarily focuses on physico-chemical capacities of soil. In this framing, the job of the farmer is to make minerals available to plants. So if you want to be a good farmer and you decide to focus on soil, you focus on soil so as to better manage soil as a nutrient reservoir. And you do that, for example, through appropriate fertilization. As changing the levels of mineral nutrients in soil has a cost, both in terms of the cost of the inputs and in terms of the cost of the labor, the time, and the machinery that you need to dedicate to achieving this, there is a financial calculation that intersects here. So there is a predicted profit from every given piece of land, and that predicted profit is used in order to decide whether it's worthwhile spending time and resources on changing the nutrient status there or not. And this comes together beautifully in what is known as precision farming, in which fields are split into zones of similar nutrient levels. And these nutrient maps are then combined with historical GPS data on yield. And they are combined to produce this really spatially nuanced variable fertilizer application plan, which basically optimizes the spend and yield calculation. And the field becomes this beautiful spatial accounting ledger or a balance sheet, where the cost of nutrients, agrochemicals, labor, and other practices are accounted for against potential yield. And that's what it looks like in a nice illustration I got from one of my participants. So what happens to soil biology in this framing? Well, farmers who are maximizing, trying to become good farmers by being these efficient accountants of costs benefits, these efficient calculators, they come to soil life because it is being presented to them by advisors and by the wider kind of farming press and also by natural scientists as a way to increase productivity. Or rather profitability, because that soil life can help here in a way by either increasing yield or decreasing spend, because if you, for example, give up tilling your soil, you have less spend. If the soil then maintains the same yield, you have you're winning on the balance sheet. You're winning. So what this means is that farmers are, so what does it do to knowledge? What kind of knowledge is being produced in this paradigm then? Well, what kind of interest is being driven? The kind of interest that is produced is the kind of interest, or an interest in the form of knowledge, which would enable more precision in this balancing of yield and spend. So farming by numbers drives an interest in greater spatial accuracy in the quantification of soil nutrients and yield potential in the space of fields. And because soil processes are very complex and soil dynamics are very complex, this configuration of soil attention also produces a search for tools which would enable a greater intervention accuracy. And what I mean here is that yield is not just dependent on the optimum nutrient status of nutrients in the soil. There are also other elements, such as pH, there is water over availability, there is drought, soil structure plays a role, compaction plays a role, levels of organic matter, lots of things play a role, the presence of soil, negative soil organisms, etc. So what happens is that land managers, who are still trying to be these optimizers, employ ever more in-field and also laboratory forms of testing, so to shine a light on all these additional factors, all these additional soil qualities, so that they can become more efficient, more productive. So I think it's really fascinating how this farming by numbers approach basically narrows the farmer-soil relationality to the circulation of money. And at the same time, it configures the professional identity of a good farmer as an expert calculator of input-output. That's what a farmer becomes. And it's against this background of farming by numbers that an interest in soil life emerges. Because while an interest in profitability is very often the starting point for an investigation, what farmers who take an interest in soil actually find is that soil organisms and soil processes are much more expansive than what can be accounted for. And that drives a huge curiosity. And I find, and also gives rise to very interesting forms of ethics. So while we're starting to attend to soil ecosystems as this sort of new element in a trajectory towards financially successful farming, what happens is that when all the other, sorry, I've got the wrong slide. So just to come back to this slide, this quote basically is here to illustrate how the interest to soil life comes in as this part of this intensification. It was a very interesting conversation in which this very productive farmer was comparing his soils, trying to compare his soils with the exact same soil type of his neighbor who is doing much better. And his soils look no different to my soils. And so you think the secret must be in there. The secret must be in there. If only I have more specific information, if only I have more detailed information, I will come to the heart of the matter and I will be able to increase my yield as well. And this is where the interest in soil life comes as this hidden variable, this elusive object. So the problem with this drive towards intensification of knowledge about soil organisms is that actually soil ecologies are very poorly understood by science. So while in agronomy, farmers are used to asking a question and receiving something in a box or having some sort of a benchmark to which they can relate, when it comes to asking questions about soil ecology, all that they can receive are very broad rules of thumb for behavior. Because the relationship between specific land management practices and the behavior of soil ecologies, the composition of soil ecologies is really not understood. This is all very new to natural sciences. And that creates such an interesting break for farmers who continue on this path, because all of a sudden, the dominance of scientific forms of knowledge in agri-environments is unsettled. It disappears. And that creates an opening for a very different form of attention to emerge, even for those farmers who always previously may have depended on this agronomic paradigm. So what happens is that the focus shifts from mineral nutrition to soil health, and that brings into view very poorly defined and interesting entities, which are soil ecosystems. Because soils are interconnected and dynamic ecologies, they don't have very clear boundaries. They are characterized by complex relations, complex interdependencies. It's an elusive object, and it's a fascinating object. And I brought up some quotes here from the interviews about this because I feel that they illustrate really well the wonder and also the sudden impotence of science in the face of soil ecology as this mysterious world that the farmers are trying to get their head around and that they're trying to sort of find a purchase in. And there is the other very important element of getting to grip with soil ecosystems, which unsettles the scientific dominance, the dominance of the scientific ontology, in that knowing soil ecosystems demands an embodied form of practice. So you can send your samples into the lab, etc. You can do that, but this is always accompanied by or contextualized within a process of just getting to know your soils through your body and through your own observation. And it's also a knowledge that is produced by the farmers, not by the external experts. So smelling, touching soils, doing structure analysis, doing the spade test, which really for most farmers just means basically making a hole in the ground and having a look. All of these are experiences that farmers start to participate in as they get involved in this regenerative agriculture sort of journey and this intensification of attention to soils. Farmers learn from one another, they explore online tutorials, they become knowledge bricoleurs, even more than before, because there are very few certified and certified and top-down sources of advice. So the knowledge search becomes very wide and very agnostic as to where the knowledge may come from, which creates new alliances between organic farming and conventional farming, for example, which is pretty fascinating. So overall, soil health assessments are more a craft than they are a science. They're more an art, and they rely on developing these situated judgments. And that's very different to the previous dependence on quantified measurements that I have described. So these are just some examples of the interviewees telling us about how they learn to pay attention to soil through measures associated with plant roots or soil structure, field drainage, presence of earthworms, etc., crop behavior. And I can talk more about these different ways of developing what some have described to me as a feel for the soil, which is very different to what they had previously. So what happens there is that this way of engaging with soil health as something that exists and something that you as a farmer, as a land manager, want to get to know, means that you suspend the logic of farming by numbers, because accounting is no longer possible. There is uncertainty about both the shape of the entity that you're dealing with, these relational networks that soil are, and there is also uncertainty around the processes, what is actually going on. And there is uncertainty about your own practices. What effects do my practices have on this ecosystem? So when neither the activities of the land manager, nor of the entities and the processes, nor of the relations between them can be expertly calculated and financially valued, money can no longer form a point of reference. It's no longer the primary point of reference. And that creates these conditions where other encounters can generate other modes of attachment, interest, and affect, which go beyond just money. And it's this expansive and probing attention which then forces thought this is another term from Stengers. It forces thought about management practices and also about the wider role that farming plays in agri-environments. And that's another quote from an interview that I did on this soil sensing sort of question, where the interviewee was talking about this process of his intensification of attention. So there's a kind of a list of things to do. And then you run out of the things that you know to do. And then there's the whole set of things that you're uncertain about. You mustn't use fungicides, but if you're not using fungicides, then maybe you also shouldn't use glyphosate. And if you're not using glyphosate, then where does that take you? You're kind of on a journey from must do this, shouldn't do that. Perhaps this also has a bad effect. Where does it take me? What is the shape of the farming system when I come out of it at the other end? It's very unclear and very individual. So this attentiveness, which interrogates existing human and more than human arrangements and experiments with new practices, I think is fascinating and is foundational to attending to Gaia. And I'll tell you how in the final few slides. But what is very striking to me when I'm interviewing farmers about these practices is how fragile these new modes of attention are. How much uncertainty they create, how much of an identity crisis they can create in the farmers who are learning soils differently, who are learning soils as not just nutrient reservoirs, as more than numbers in a spreadsheet. And understanding these struggles that these farmers face, I found it very helpful to come back to Arendt in order to understand that what is going on here is this double alienation from soil itself and also from other farmers and from society more broadly. Because what we're facing is a way of creating meaning which doesn't depend on economic models. And then all of a sudden you are at sea. If you can't put a number on it, it's not valuable to talk about. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. In spite of the very rich experiences of soil observation that my interviewees would quote, soils become in a way a scientific matter. So the qualities of soil that can be observed through the farmer's own sensorium are treated by my participants as suspect and untrustworthy. At the same time, the scientific ontology comes back. The soil's true nature is seen as inaccessible and fundamental, and a truth that can only be revealed through scientific investigation. And so even though these farmers are very knowledgeable, they tend to compare their own expertise negatively with scientific forms of knowing soils, in spite of their limitations. And then what also happens is that participants then question the value of their attention to soil, the value of spending time on developing these soil health practices, these soil health attentiveness. Because even when it's described as something that's valued individually, interviewees were often very anxious about how the broader societal recognition of spending time in this way, of spending resources in this way. Because in modern society, actions are valued in reference to their utility. So for example, how far they increase the efficiency and productivity of labor. But because it's impossible to quantify soil life, our participants couldn't link their soil attention back to utility. And they really try. They when they can, it's very satisfying. And everything else that can't be linked to utility is very frustrating. And this produces a sort of a devaluation of their own expertise for the farmers, the expertise in soil health. And that means that this expertise can't be a foundation for a different form of agricultural adaptation. Which is the problem that I think we should address. There we go. There are some quotes illustrating that. I need to prove that there is a financial, or if not a financial, some sort of a tangible benefit. I need to quantify this. I need a graph. We've done our research, etc. Quantification is really needed. So is there a problem? Well, I think it is. I think it is a problem. This is a bit speculative, but it's not mad. So bear with me. Arendt was very mindful of a huge risk that humanity as a civilization, if you like, brings upon itself if it enrolls all experience into utility-oriented quantification. Because in a society that's dominated by labor, technosciences always have an upper hand because they are much better at maximizing utility. So they are very well placed to increasingly dominate action. All the areas that used to be parts of human work, such as agriculture, are increasingly taken over by technosciences. And the consequence of that is that our experience of the world is limited. And so our natality, our creativity becomes limited. So for our interviewees, people I quote in this presentation, scientific knowledge of soil ecosystems promises a level of effectiveness and efficiency which can never be matched by their own assessments. And that's a very poignant quote to illustrate that. Even though science today is a bit confused and overwhelmed by the complexity of soil ecosystems, surely in the future, big data, science, machine intelligence, they will all sort it out for us. And then, it will be big data making decisions because a human brain could not possibly hold all the variables in place. And for me, that's a really chilling vision of an agrarian future because it's a logical conclusion of the ever more efficient pursuit of utility through technological progress, and that ultimately devalues both nature and humanity. And it also forecloses our strategies for actually responding to Gaia and interacting with Gaia. Because in this vision, the experience of nature through labor is increasingly replaced by the pursuit of narrow rationality, a reckoning with consequences, which is basically what computers do. Whereas human experience of nature and of other humans gives rise to natality, to creativity. This is the unique and creative response of each human being to the conditions of their own existence. Reasoning as calculation is something that electronic instruments can do much better than we do. And so, if I think about my farmers interviewed for this project, they see themselves as unperfect reckoners. And so they are nearly willing to remove themselves from the equation, to remove themselves from the experience of nature and farming. Because if the only objective of farming is to be ever more efficient and to create ever greater utility, then machines can do it better. Thank you very much. So that means that the creativity that arises from the meetings with soils, from meetings with environments is squashed. The desire for rational control forecloses any openings to anything that's genuinely novel. Engagement with nature as a realm beyond the human is destroyed. All that remains is a rampant humanization as ever more and more of the earth becomes enrolled in the process of supporting human life understood as an animal utility. And to take it into a complete extreme, if we replace the encounter between humans and nature with automated labor, ultimately we don't even need society, because human life is then limited to just bodily existence, to just animal existence. Let's remember that for Arendt and for many others, the highest expression of humanity is the pursuit of meaning. But in a society dominated by utility and dedicated to progress, there isn't a greater, richer debate about meaning. Rather, the debate about meaning becomes impossible because we are cut off from a meaningful experience of the earth, and we are cut off from a meaningful experience of one another. In a society dominated by utility, and when utility is increasingly best accomplished with no input from the vast majority of the population, there is nothing for us to talk about. And that's a really chilling premonition. So how can we rescue reckoning and science from a pursuit of utility as the only value? And how can we pluralize the values that we pursue through agriculture? How can we extend and expand our knowledge making? These are my last few slides where I'm trying to build a bridge into the future. So I think that, you know, creating and acting on new meanings requires more than human individuals. And in social sciences, I think we have been a bit guilty in the new materialism and affect in more than human studies of focusing on individuals. And Aaron says, you know, to build something that has a utility, a meaning, sorry, that has a meaning, a societal meaning, you need a group. To men, the reality of the world is guaranteed by the presence of others, by it appearing to all. So while the sort of ethical encounters and affects that we study in more than human social sciences may provide a sort of a starting point, these have to connect to achieve ontological effects. They have to be collectively woven into new ways of being. We need what Arendt terms new forms of common sense. And that is what I understand as a form of reasoning which doesn't start from the rules for rational behavior as dictated by utility, but from the experience of being earthly, of being of condition of being human, as someone who participates in earth processes in a way that is more than utilitarian. So it's a coming back to the senses in a way. So what are these conditions under which we could make these new forms of knowledge that are not utility oriented, not only utility oriented? Well, I think that the first really clear condition is decentering of sciences as the primary speakers for nature. We need to denaturalize nature as something that belongs to the sciences. And, you know, environmental humanities and a lot of social sciences are doing a very good job of doing that, but we need to do much more of that. The decolonization movement is here a great ally, definitely. Because I think that the art of paying attention to Gaia does not call for ever more precise and objective descriptions of a natural world out there as something that is independent. Rather, what we need are forms of knowledge which would help us to problematize the agency of the material world as already entangled with very situated human concerns. If we surrender all responsibility for engaging with nature to technosciences, we pretty much guarantee a loss of sensitivity to Gaia. We need a return of the sciences from the universal to the earthly, from the earth as if we lived somewhere else, as Latour says, to the earth as something that we are in rather than on. So what that means in practice is moving inquiries from laboratory into the wild, as Callan says. And that's not just a shift in scales. That's not just, you know, moving inquiry from universities to landscapes. Because as I have illustrated from interviews with my farmer participants, these alienations, the way that we're alienated from nature is something that is meaningful to us, is also something that's internalized. So it's not enough to bring locals into research, to put it bluntly, because the locals can be just as alienated from the natures in which they live as the experts who come in to create these new forms of research. So the challenge is not just of scale, it's not just of participation, but it's a challenge of constructing possibilities for a different form of attention to emerge and persist as a shared object of concern. So that means composing new collectives in a way that non-human voice is amplified and has a place. And it is that can form a foundation of a new common sense, which is understood not as a sort of dominant view imposed by the powerful, but as something that emerges from an analysis of situations in place, which bring together humans and non-humans. And I think I'll finish here because I'm sure that I have been talking for a long time. I completely lost track of time.
Oh, you were great, Anna. Thank you. Yeah, feel free to take your last words. I don't want to take them away from you.
Okay, well, maybe I'll just finish with this little quote from Danowski and Viveros de Castro, to come back to our Anthropocene and how Anthropocene is. We can reclaim the Anthropocene, not as the time of a universal human, but actually as the time of the peoples. So Danowski and Viveros de Castro write about the peoples, which are human, non-human collectives that emerge in places and that are trying to live together, that are trying to find ways of living together, and which are diverse and non-homogeneous. This is how we can rewrite the Anthropocene as a time of diversity. And I find that a much more inspiring vision of the future than robot farming and robot interactions. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Anna. I've been furiously taking notes to try to assemble something coherent and thoughtful in response to this. Yeah, you've really taken us on a whirlwind through Arendt, through the history of agriculture and agronomy and extension science. Yeah, a lot of resonance, I think, also with the way agricultural knowledge has developed within our university in Wageningen, and the way our relationship to the material world is changed as a result of that. So I think we have also an interesting context here to place these debates. But in terms of place, I was often left wondering if these relationships you observed or these critiques you observed do have sort of a placed element to them. So is it perhaps particular to farmers in a European context, or would we observe these same types of alienation in other contexts where there's maybe more of a tradition of other forms of knowledge or indigenous knowledge? So I was curious about that. So maybe that's something we can discuss more. And with Arendt, a lot of the language around labor and work. So my training is in feminist geography. So immediately all these bells were ringing around social reproduction and care work, and kind of the ways that we've split up the economy and split up creativity and labor to essentially hide and devalue a huge amount of work and a huge amount of labor that's necessary for the social reproduction of life on this planet. So I kind of experienced that form of alienation as also an acutely feminist concern for how we think about and talk about the economy and whose labor is included in that. So then I started, of course, drawing an iceberg while you were talking. So on the tip of the iceberg, we really have the nutrients, the minerals, the nutritional requirements of soil and farming by the numbers. And I really saw this as like sort of an iceberg where farmers were really digging into the soil and being subsumed by this whole under the soil iceberg of magic, of microbes, of health and non-humans, of Gaia. And really seeing soil as this place of transformative learning, which brings me to another connection. At the Center for Space, Place, and Society, we've been on this journey in transformative learning. We've launched a transformative learning hub, which is really about kind of connecting head, heart, and hand, and kind of tapping into things like emotion and curiosity and joyfulness to basically learn how to become different kinds of humans through education and other things and research. So I was also curious to explore that more with you about how and when and for whom and in what circumstances soil becomes a place for transformative learning, and what that can open up in terms of the democratization of knowledge, and even legitimate feelings and emotions and interactions. Because I was so struck by this visual of farmland as a balance sheet, as a ledger, that we're just kind of balancing the numbers. And I think in the Netherlands, we're so steeped in this discourse of the good farmer. One of my students introduced me to this concept just last year. I didn't know about it. But yeah, the good farmer isn't someone who's good. She's someone who's rational, responsible, highly profitable. And there really isn't a lot of room there for other ways of being good. So this, yeah, our student Nijnke Bilker did a whole discourse analysis of, other ways of being a good farmer and other ways that, in her case, CSA farmers were trying to negotiate with these, the limitations of trying to be a good farmer and trying to create other ways for themselves of being a good farmer. Because I think a lot of this then does come back to kind of self-identity and how you kind of justify your place in the world and seek recognition and acknowledgement and all these things, which I hear in a lot of the anxiety that your farmers express, like, oh no, what if I'm doing it wrong? I don't know. Can someone out there give me a number to show that I'm
That's
valid?
right.
Yeah. Yeah. And then on a more meta level, I think throughout this, I'm not a farmer. But I think even just the experience of working in the neoliberal university really, really, you can't. This kind of knowledge and this kind of analysis is so accurate for how we measure ourselves and how we account for ourselves.
Yeah.
And I feel like we've been kind of had a sneak peek at this future of double or triple or quadruple alienation working the way we have been working this year exclusively online.
Yes. Yeah,
So
especially
I've just been maintaining bare life and connecting.
Yeah, that's actually such a great point. We were just discussing this yesterday. I was hosting a workshop as part of a research project I'm doing right now, and we were talking about how Zoom creates, it's very utilitarian. It limits the interaction to the utility. You go through the agenda and you deliver what is on the agenda, and all the stuff that is creativity, that is serendipity, that is what Arendt would call natality, that comes about from having a tea together and going to the pub and going for a walk during the break and talking in an unstructured way, all of that is lost. And so this is this narrowing, which I can see with relation to soil. So, oh gosh, so much to talk about.
Maybe do you want to start with this maybe this question of place, where this knowledge lives, where these relations live?
Yeah, I mean, there is a reason why I focus on modern conventional farming. Because it is the dominant force. That's what receives funding. That is what restructures the world. And absolutely different ways of thinking about soil, relating to soil, and so thinking about agriculture and being human exist, certainly. But they are so threatened and they are so fragile. They're constantly threatened and they're constantly fragile. And there's a lot to like. In an ideal world, we want a dialogue, but I think what I really want to do is strike at the heart of the beast, with all of these other allies as well. So there is a reason why I focus on modern conventional farming. And what I'm finding fascinating about soils is that modern conventional farming is becoming the space of transformative learning. And so that this attention to soil is creating the sort of a clash, an identity crisis for farming, in which there is one direction which pulls into this increased utility, robot farming, satellite sensing, Amazon Inc. farms, which we may see in not a very far future. Bill Gates is buying massive amounts of land in the US. So here's a disaster waiting to happen, or a particular scenario waiting to happen. And on the other hand, there is this sudden pull through soil because of this uncertainty that it creates towards a very different way of farming. But I find it very fragile and very important to support. So when I go to farming conferences by regenerative agriculture farmers, I find it wonderful how the presentations always start with regenerative farming has allowed me to increase my profitability. Here are some numbers. Look at these numbers. Here are more numbers. Here's my soil analysis. And then at the end, we come to pictures of birds and wildlife and soil structure and plant roots. Attempts to share and create a shared meaning around more than numbers and around more than utility. So this collective element of that you have spoken about in your comments, this collective element is for me absolutely crucial. And I think we have a duty as researchers to find these ways of these emerging ways of creating new forms of identity, of recognizing different things as evidence, different things as representation, and fostering them so that we can resist the utility drive, basically.
Yeah, that is something I'm also really curious about, where these Gaian collectives live and how we can learn to recognize them. I mean, how do we know when we're in a Gaian collective?
So Stengers writes about them. Well, in a way, when I'm calling what I'm calling Gaian collectives has a continuity from kind of more classic science and technology studies about more than human publics, or publics that come together around environmental concerns, that come together around health concerns. Stengers always writes about the GMO protest as a sort of that was, I could describe that as a Gaian collective. He was a moment in which there was sort of an existential, what was perceived as an existential threat, and that mobilized people to include completely to include a certain amount of kind of non-social entities or new social entities, non-human entities, into collective decision making. So decision making was not just about humans, it was about the future of humans and plants and ecosystems. And you created a Gaian collective, a way of trying to think about going forward together in which people were speaking for nature in more than just utilitarian terms, but they were talking about risk and care and affect. And I think that these Gaian collectives emerge when there are emergencies. You know, you could describe the protests against the flooding of hunting grounds by indigenous communities as a Gaian collective. Here are people who are saying, we don't exist as a people without this non-human world, without this particular bit or this particular, you know, we always speak for a river, we always speak for a species, we speak for things that we are connected with. This is where the boundary between the human and the non-human gets erased, when the bit that makes us human, that is a non-human element, is threatened. But for me, the problem is that these Gaian collectives today come into being in moments of existential threat.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact is that the whole planet is under existential threat now, or rather that humanity, because the planet will be fine, the Gaia will be fine, different species will not be fine, but humanity on the planet is under an existential threat, and yet we are behaving, as Greta Thunberg says, you know, as if the house was not on fire. So I think we need to find ways of recognizing and valuing these relationships with the non-human world, which are activated as part of normality, rather than only as moments of existential threat. And this is what these farmers are trying to do, which is why I'm finding it so fascinating that they start by, as I said, translating regenerative farming into money, but they end up talking about, well, actually, this is a different way of being a farmer. This is a different way of being a human being. The transformative effects go beyond forming a different form of economy.
Yeah, and I think that seems a really necessary antidote to what you identify as sort of the very methodological individualism of a lot of studies on post-humanism or affect, which, yeah, we really need to figure out how to get moved from these ethical encounters and sort of aha moments of curiosity to actual collective action. I want to move to some of the questions because
Yeah,
we
sure.
have a few and they all look really interesting. I'm wondering, Paul, if you're here, you have two quite long questions. I'm wondering if I can put you on the spot to synthesize them into one short question. I'm going to unmute you.
Okay.
I can hear you now.
Do I work now?
Yes.
Oops. Hello?
Hi.
Yep, we hear you. Oh.
Yep.
Yep.
Can you hear
You're
me?
here. Yes.
Yeah. Well, it was actually meant as one question. Simply my clumsiness with handling the keyboard made it into two questions. But I was struck by your farming by numbers, while I come across farmers, who are working with all sorts of modern equipment. They call themselves farmers by instruction. And interestingly, they are sort of subjected to all sorts of repertoires of instruction, and if you don't follow the instruction, you won't get the goodies that modernization brings. So farming by instruction, I found quite a sort of an attribute to the way NGOs, Agra, Monsanto, Dutch government funding agencies, but also the Kenyan government, of course, is trying to sort of model farming around, let's say, the application of agrarian sciences, because this is straightforward, sort of the green revolution in practice. But then you come across people that say, well, nah, I don't like it. Let me farm my own way. And sort of their farming, if you study the way they farm what Van der Ploeg calls economically. They keep their own seeds, they save their own seeds for years, use local seeds, use local ways of reproducing soil fertility. They talk very sort of intimately about the land, about the soils, they know their soils. But then you have this category, and I'm struggling with this category, and I call them the pragmatists, the farming pragmatically, because they know that sort of economical farming is the best way to go, particularly when you are cash strapped. It's not about poverty; it's about being cash, not having the resources actually to purchase all these modern Monsanto varieties. So they rely on projects and programs to sort of access the hybrid maize, which produces a beautiful yield, because you can pay school fees with it. You can pay your laborers in kind with hybrid maize, but you keep your local maize that you produce for yourself, right? Because it's tasty, it's culturally responsible to grow these maize varieties. So they take that. That's why I'm calling them farming pragmatically. They farm both ways, as it were. They take both sides. So it's with the middle category that I'm struggling with.
So what's your question about the category, Paul?
Well, whether Anna sort of can work with my category of pragmatic farmers.
It's interesting.
Does it make sense?
Yes. However, my description of farming by numbers was primarily meant to indicate the dominant way of relating to soil. So instead of farming by numbers, let's call it understanding soil by numbers. But it's not just the understanding, because it's also the action. So what I was saying is that in my experience across many research projects with conventional modern farmers, the primary understanding of soil is directed by this accounting logic, the intersection between nutrients and the cost of labor versus the output in yield. So I'm not sure how to incorporate how how to incorporate thinking about this pragmatism, because it doesn't quite fit. But I would be very interested to know what forms of soil kind of logic underpin pragmatic farming, for example. Because for what I've observed is that the farming by numbers paradigm is so powerful because it is so universally understood. Every farmer can then say, these are my numbers, and that makes me a good farmer to the agronomist, to their colleague. So farming by numbers is so powerful also because it provides a form of evidence which very clearly translates into a self-value. What are I would be, it would be really fascinating to know what these farmers that you work with, what enables them to talk about their soil practices to one another, and how that links with their self-identity perceptions of doing a good job and being a good human being.
Thanks, Anna. I want to give the floor to Lori Novatsky. If you are here, I will unmute you. You have a question about AI and big data. And I found you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, hi. Well, first, thank you so much for such a wonderful and thoughtful presentation. I'm out here in kind of the middle of the United States, at Iowa State University, and I work with extension here. So, perhaps you all are familiar with the fact that extension has a little bit of a complicated history with sort of top-down decision-making, relying on the knowledge deficit idea that if we just teach people, they'll do the right thing and they'll learn, but that's clearly been insufficient when it comes to kind of soil health and conservation. So I'm curious your thoughts about, assuming that this march towards AI and big data is inevitable and that we will move more towards more automated and efficient agriculture, even more so than we are now. If you have any thoughts about how we can work with farmers and the agricultural community to reclaim uncertainty, I'm really interested in kind of embracing uncertainty instead of sort of preaching good practices to farmers. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts about whether it's possible for outreach professionals and conservation professionals who are working with farmers to sort of help farmers in the agricultural community to use AI and big data and work with it to ask more questions about their farms and more kind of embrace more complex ideas about soil health or other issues, as opposed to just trying to use it to answer questions about their farms.
Thank you. That's a great question, Laurie, and it hits the nail on the head beautifully. And it kind of links to what I see as these conditions for the Gaian collectives, or what makes a Gaian collective. There's nothing intrinsically wrong with AI. There's nothing intrinsically wrong with big data. There's nothing intrinsically wrong with technoscience at all. It's, as you identify, the who gets to ask the questions, right? Who gets to ask the questions, and that, there is a possibility that shouldn't be discounted, and it's something that we can support in our work as rural sociologists, environmental social scientists, of making environmental sensing, which underpins AI and these big kind of decision-making mechanisms. Environmental sensing can be a citizen power. There is nothing intrinsically that goes against us. So I think that there's sort of the sensing is the new battleground. This is actually where we have an opportunity to make a difference and to reclaim who gets to ask the questions by making sure that everyone participates in the creation of data and everyone participates in the setting of the questions that underpin this collection of data. And there, uncertainty becomes very much part of the conversation then, right? Because what is it that you're collecting data about? How does that actually link with action? Instead of pretending that there is an XY relationship, which there never is in ecologies, you can use scientific tools, scientific instruments to ask questions about place and how things actually happen in a particular location, which will always be very highly kind of contingent and uncertain, and always lead to more and more questions, and will always give you just provisional answers, which is what farmers are very used to working with. You have a provisional answer, you use fuzzy logic, you go with the most likely outcome, and you try, and then you try again, which is also the basis of care. You try and try again, and you're never satisfied. So for me, that's a really important arena for social science to focus on, actually, environmental sensing and the sort of reclaiming of knowledge making, which is becoming more accessible.
I noticed that we are at 4:30, and I wanted to ask Anna, do you have 15 more minutes to go through a few more of these questions with us? I think they're fascinating. Okay,
yes.
Well, we'll see who's still here. Philippa has a really interesting question about Indigenous epistemologies. If she's here, I'll ask her to ask it.
Yes, can you hear me?
You're very quiet.
Oh, sorry. How's that? I'm a bit closer
Better,
to the mic now. Okay. So thanks very much, Anna. It was a really fascinating talk. I've been a bit cheeky and asked 2 questions, so you can just pick one of them if that's better. But you mentioned about the decolonization movement, and I was kind of wondering if you could maybe expand a bit more on how these ideas draw on Indigenous epistemologies. I think we're seeing that more and more with the sort of planetary health movement and connecting that with these kind of ancient ideas. And then a lot of what you were saying also made me think a lot about the parallels with, in terms of I've forgotten how to say that word.
Automation?
Automation. The parallels with cellular agriculture, in terms of possible like food futures that are very technoscientific. And I was kind of wondering if you can expand on how this idea of dual alienation relates to livestock, and to different livestock futures.
Sorry, the second question was so interesting. I forgot the first one.
The first one was just about
decolonization. Yes.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so to tackle that one first, I think decolonization has a lot of fantastic things going for it, but specifically in relation to this question of what it can do to pluralize our knowledges of environment and human environmental relations. Well, there's like a double movement. On the one hand, decolonization is now starting to come into natural sciences, which is fantastic. You start seeing these papers that are getting written from within natural sciences. I'm mainly observing soil sciences that are starting to talk about, soil science is actually an outcome of a very particular historical and geographical context. It does not actually correspond very well to reality on the ground. It's not the best description. I mean, there's a whole field called ethnopedology, which is telling, we have the knowledge, they have ethnopedology. But now there is a conversation starting to emerge around. Sorry, I just got a text message and it distracted me. So there's a conversation starting to emerge around basically modern science as a one form of knowledge. So that's great. So that's a real power of decolonization on the one hand. And on the other, the valorization of non-scientific forms of knowing is extremely valuable. So together, I think these two have a really transformative potential for the future of knowledge. But it's extremely, extremely exciting. the question about alienation and livestock, gosh, that would be enough for another paper, which I would have to co-write with my great colleague Alex Sexton. So if you're interested in cellular agriculture and what is going on there, and the intersection of technoscience and capital, I think I can do no better job than to send you to Alex Sexton's work on that, and dodge the question, if that's okay.
That's great.
Great answer. Thank you. I was wondering if Marguerite is still here. Otherwise, I will read her question. I see she's here. I will unmute her.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Anna. Thank you very much. I really appreciate the debate you're addressing, but I think that the questions came from a kind of that we bother about the binary put of the dominance and something that has to happen. And my question relates to that. I think for the argument, it's very well to put and to look internally into the farmers as they are dominant presenting now. But to put more diversity into it, we have wonderful examples from the past, from pragmatics, from all kinds of other people who are trying to do the, things differently. And I was asking, are you considering to taking them in your story, in the narrative, so people can have actually also interesting, inspiring sources? I was thinking about the Healthy and Life Living Souls movement, for instance, by Lady Balfour. A lot of critical, biodynamic, interesting historical examples we have there, but we normally don't hear about it. What do you think of that?
I think you're absolutely right, Marguerite, that there is already within, let's call it Western culture, a wealth of alternative soil relationalities. And what's really fascinating, you know, as I said at the beginning kind of the questions, I kind of try to focus on the dominant, on the modern farming paradigm, and I kind of start from there because it's so destructive. But what is fascinating for me to see is that these engagements with soil are starting from this modernist paradigm, because of the lack of scientific answers around soil health. They are bringing in these alternative soil knowledges, which is fascinating. So these, because there usually exists such impermeable boundaries, cultural boundaries within farming communities between different farming styles. But you go to a conference like Groundswell in the UK now, which brings together regenerative farmers, and you have permaculturalists, you have biodynamic farmers, you have organic farmers, and you have conventional big ag, and you have even agri-tech companies and agrochemical companies, and they're all talking together. So that's, for me, really fascinating. And I'm really interested to see how these alternative forms of knowledge can be brought in to create this new shared common sense. So if we're saying that utility is not or quantification and utility is not the only common language that we need in order to talk about soil, because it doesn't it does not exhaust the topic, what are other terms, what are other forms of evidence and other stories that we can tell about our relationships with soil in farming, for example, and in other fields, that provide the recognition that is not just me telling myself about what I'm doing and figuring things out and feeling curiosity, but that create a recognition in someone else that is, that is positive. So that I don't say something like, oh, I think my soil has a spirit, and I get laughed out of the room, Do you know what I mean? So for me, there is a reservoir, but I want to see how we can draw on this reservoir to create a new form of language to talk about. So new form of evidence, new form of communication that goes beyond this farming by numbers. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, just short. I think that's very important, but then it's also important to really look into what was happening there, or what is happening there in the example of Paul. That it's away from only ideologically put them in some frames, but actually look and broaden the circle of people talking with each others about the soil and how they see it, not come into this ideological frames we made later.
Absolutely, I agree.
I'll move on to Dan's question. I'm going to unmute you, Dan. I think we have the possibility to hear you now. Otherwise, I will ask your question for you. Dan asks, how do you look to the relation to the existential questions in Gaia? Is Gaia also interpreted as being a part of ourselves as human beings?
Wow, that's a big one. Depends who you ask. I haven't come up with my own definition of Gaia, so there is nothing I could pull up and say this is what I stand for. What I really like, the reason why I really like this concept is that it brings together these natural science perspectives, earth science perspectives, and social science perspectives. So in the way that I was trying to introduce at the beginning of the talk, if we look at Gaia from a sort of earth system point of view, then humanity has a potential to be the part of Gaia. And maybe that's the thing that I think we should aspire towards. So if Gaia is the planetary capacity to maintain life, then human beings have in times past shown that they can be part of that system, that they have a capacity to support the maintenance of life. We have created, for example, agrarian landscapes that have a greater biodiversity than non-agrarian landscapes. We have examples of agricultural systems that span thousands of years, even in a particular place. So fantastic examples of being part of the system, something we should aspire to. But then there is also the Gaia maybe in this kind of more cultural, sociocultural way. Again, Gaia is something that we can aspire into being if we think that Gaia is our own human interpretation of the non-human cycles of which we are part. And here we can have an interpretation which allows us to maintain a relationship with these, such as in animistic religions, where you are always in the society of nature, and society in terms of interactions between human beings, the interactions between Gaia are also included in the interactions between human beings. There isn't a meaningful difference. So yeah, there is aspirationally, I think we should aspire to being part of Gaia. It's an open question for me whether we are, and who is the we anyway.
Yeah, great. Well, I will give Matt French the last question if he's still around. Otherwise, end with a huge thank you.
Yes, I am.
Okay.
Thank you very much. First, just to say, what a thoughtful, invigorating presentation. I found that it was really, really great. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Question, and I'm speaking from Amsterdam, so maybe it's appropriate. This is a bit of a sort of Spinozistic type question. I'm wondering if one of the leaps, the paradigm shifts needed, is to do away with this dichotomy between the biotic and the abiotic, between the living and the dead, and whether the soil including the so-called minerals, has to be regarded in a sort of broad panpsychic or a sort of cognitive striving body type sense, whether the soil has to be regarded as sentient in its entirety. And is it feasible to have that sort of metaphysical shift in outlook to stop thinking of minerals as dead?
Well, I think so. And in many ways, it's not such a crazy concept. And many people, I think, would actually recognize it at not even at such a big push. That all, if you want to look at the human body, we're just an animated bag of nitrogen, potassium, carbon, water walking around. And actually, I've just read recently a fantastic earth sciences book called "The Revolutions That Made the Earth," which had a kind of a Wittgensteinian effect on me. In that, reading the book, which is basically an earth science history of the planet, has now completely shifted my perception of the interactions between the biosphere and the geosphere, in that I see no separation between them anymore, because plants are just an instantiation of geology and atmosphere meeting, activated by the power of the sun, which is how my earth sciences colleagues used to describe this to me, and I couldn't get my head around it, but now I really, really feel it as a truth. When it comes to the question of sentience, I don't know what that would mean. There is definitely, I think that is the one of the many fascinating kind of potentials of soil, is that it really undoes the separation between the chemical and the biological, which is, to farmers so obvious. You add lime, you add nitrogen, you add phosphorus. You know that life is made of natural or chemicals, as well as it is made from its telos, its kind of process. So yeah, I think that becoming Gaia is not just focusing on life, but on the planet, which is more than just life. It's life in motion. It's life as the planet in motion.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Well, I want to thank Mark and Lisette for organizing this seminar series, and Anna for joining us, and our attendees for their thoughtful and brilliant questions. And yeah, can't thank you enough, Anna.
Thank you. It was such a pleasure in these times where, you spend too much time in your own head. It was a very valuable time for me to open my head to you and see that there is something for people to take away from this junkyard of ideas. So